pals, I'm here today to talk about what I read in the month of October. Now, October was a pretty shoddy reading month, to be honest. I read 9 books and most of them were like 2-3 star reads. And I also DNF'd, I think, 10 books. I had a couple of days where I just like DNF'd loads of books in a row. And then I also had a stack of 10 books on my physical TBR. And these 10 books were books I was unsure I definitely wanted to read, but they survived like lots of culls over the last couple of years. And so when I was in my sort of DNF heavy mood, I sat on my bed and went through all 10 of them and decided to not keep them. So they weren't really DNFs because I just sort of read little sections from each of them and the blurb and reviews. But yeah, there was a lot of books sort of removed from the house in October. I do talk about my DNFs over on Patreon, and that should be coming up probably tomorrow. And I also talk about the books that I unhauled in sort of goals catch-up videos, which I think I will be doing one this month, looking back at the last couple of months. So I may mention those books there, I'm not really sure. It might take too long to do that. So anyway, the books I read in the month of October, like I said, very, very mixed bag. I'm just going to go through them in the order that I read them because that seems like the easiest way to do this. I had a romance book out from the library called Lease on Love by Fallon Ballard. In the last couple of years, I have tried some more romance books. I tend to find them like really fun in the moment of reading them because they're super readable. Like a lot of them can be read in like one sitting. And I don't often read books that are that easy to speed through, but I tend to find lots of, I wouldn't even say the tropes, I tend to find the ending quite annoying because I feel like the happy ending is always that they get married, and I have never wanted to get married. I don't really see any point in it, and I think it's a little bit reductive when the only happy ending we can ever see is that they got married. And also, you know, there's some other things about sort of gender dynamics that tend to annoy me in these books. But I read them every now and again for a little bit of fun. And I will say, this one I had a lot of fun with initially, but I think in the final third I started to find it a bit more annoying. So trying to remember all the way back to the start of October. The premise of this is, this woman has been, I think, an accountant for years, and she leaves that job and can't afford her apartment anymore, and she manages to find a room to rent in a like amazing brownstone that this guy owns outright, even though he's only like her age, late 20s. And she met him on what she thought was like a Tinder date, but actually she'd gone on like the room sharing app. So there's sort of like an awkward meet cute. And then you sort of follow their friendship building, and you finding out more about him and like how he owns this brownstone when he's so young, and he seemingly doesn't work and like keeps his cards pretty close to his chest. And you also watch her try her hands at a floristry business that she's always wanted to try. Now, they use lots of pet names for one another, and they were pet names that were like just a bit cringe, so I found them cringe. Also, like all the things about the guy, I pretty much figured out in the first 2 pages of meeting him. So when they were like massive reveals later on, it was a bit like, oh, I've known this for like hundreds of pages. And also, I've had this complaint with a couple of romance books where somebody stumbles across some type of really good luck that's usually to do with money. Sometimes an inheritance. In this book, she stumbles across this guy who's renting this brownstone room out for way too little because he doesn't need the money and he just wants company. And also he like lets her use like a whole floor of his house for her business. And then it's like this big moral that like she's turned her life around, and if you only give things a go, then you can like have this dream you've always wanted to have, which isn't true, right? Because she has this dream because she manages to get a brownstone super cheap, and she manages to live with a millionaire who will just like let her use all of his space and stuff. So yeah, I enjoyed it for what it was, but there are things about romance books that annoyed me, like I said. I then read Milk, Blood, Heat by Dantiel W. Moniz. This is a short story collection. I had really high hopes for this. I heard a lot about this when it first came out. This is a short story collection set in Florida. I think all the stories take place in Florida. The majority of the stories are from the perspective of Black women and girls, but there are 1 or maybe 2 from the perspective of Black men. And yeah, like, I was really hoping to enjoy this one, but I just felt like the writing was entirely competent. There wasn't really anything I could criticise, but the stories just didn't really like stick the landing. Like I just sort of finished them and felt a bit like, like that was good, but that should be like the filler story in the collection, whereas like they were all like that. So I think I would watch this author's career. I would be interested to see what she releases in the future. It's definitely not put me off, but I'd also find this one quite difficult to recommend over a lot of much more successful short story collections I've read. And also I only really find sort of two of the stories memorable, those being the first story, which has quite a sort of shocking ending, hence it being memorable, and also the story from the perspective of a man. I found that one quite memorable. I think for me that was probably the strongest story in the collection, but I don't remember any of the others now, and it's only been like a few weeks. Then I listened to, on audio, Why Did You Stay? A memoir about self-worth by Rebecca Humphreys. You've probably heard a lot of people talk about this one, so I won't go into too much detail about what it's about. I don't watch Strictly Come Dancing, but a few years ago, this woman, her partner was on Strictly Come Dancing. He is a British comedian. He famously was caught on camera getting off with his dancer, like cheating on her, and she then released a statement saying like he'd been an awful man to be in a relationship with, like lots of gaslighting. And somebody responded saying, if you were so bad, why did you stay? And this book is sort of a response to that, not only for Rebecca Humphreys, but also for all people who stay in these types of relationships, and sort of validating why people stay. And it's quite smartly structured. So there'll be a chapter which is why did you stay, which is from the moment they met one another and how she sort of fell head over heels in love with him. The wheelie bin lorry is outside, so if you can see flashing lights on me, that is the wheelie bin lorry, apologies. And then the other chapters are why did you leave, and they're from the moment she found out he was cheating on her, and so these sort of chapters move in tandem with one another, which I thought was a quite interesting way to structure it. I really liked her voice. She sort of reminded me of, if you've ever read any rom-coms by Valerie McFarlane, I feel like Rebecca Humphreys could probably write fiction like that, and it would be quite enjoyable. She's very funny and she has a very good delivery. So I don't think I'd have finished it if I was reading it physically. I think I enjoyed it as much as I did because she was performing it so well on audio. She's an actress herself, so of course she's going to be good at performing it. But I had quite a few issues with this book, okay? My biggest issue is that I felt like Rebecca Humphreys doesn't really acknowledge her privilege. Now, she acknowledges that she wasn't really getting a lot of work while she was with her partner, and he was paying for a lot of their lifestyle, but the lifestyle was still pretty extravagant. They're well off and live in a very nice part of London. I don't know if you heard that. And also, she has a really good group of friends around her who seem to be pretty financially stable. So after the moment she breaks up with this guy, she gets to live with her friends and it doesn't appear to have to pay them any rent. She gets to go on quite a lot of like nice weekends away with other friends. And I was just thinking while I was listening to it, like there's people who would have been in that horrific relationship, that really toxic relationship, and you're sort of trying to be the voice for those people and say, I'm writing this for me, but also for them. But a lot of these people won't relate to you at all because they will have come out of those relationships alone with no money, like a minimum wage job and like massively struggling. And I'm not saying you have to be able to speak on behalf of everybody's experiences because that's impossible. But I think Rebecca Humphreys should have done a bit more work at acknowledging that she wasn't speaking for all those people. And I also felt there was a touch of privilege in how she speaks about where she's from. So she happens to be from Norwich, which is where I now live. And look, I'm not one of those people who's like super proud of where they live in like, I'm not willing to hear it slated. I've been to quite a lot of cities in the UK and I do happen to think Norwich is like a very nice city. It's a very nice place to live. I feel very fortunate. And so when I heard her slating Norwich, I just felt for people who haven't been here, particularly people from other countries, she talks about a lot of the areas being rough. That's the term she uses. She also talks about it being like sort of arse end of nowhere, and she says like, oh God, if I have to go and live back with my parents or if I have to go live back in Norwich, that would be absolutely tragic and like the worst thing that ever happens to me. Just to put this in perspective, okay, you can get a train from Norwich to London, it takes an hour and 50 minutes. I'm not saying that's as quick as it should be, but it's not that long. And also, yeah, it's a little bit out of the way, but Norwich is not a city that, if you were going to talk about areas that are impoverished and struggling and need funding put into them, by the government. Norwich is not one of those cities. So I just found her representation of Norwich as a city a little bit privileged. That irked me a little bit. And I also just felt that the final third of the book just went on a little bit too long. It was her talking about her starting to date new people. And yeah, I was at the point where I was like, you've sort of got your point across, I've enjoyed your story, now I just feel like we're just sort of treading water. So, you know, there was elements of this I enjoyed, but I wouldn't run around recommending it. This next book I also listened on audio, and I also think I wouldn't have finished this if I'd been reading it, and that is Ghosts by Dolly Alderton. I pretty much downloaded this because of who the narrator is. I can't now remember her name, but I will put her here. She's a British actress. I very much like her voice. And I just felt like an easy listen, and I thought this was going to be that. And this is quite an odd blend, right? Because it is an easy listen, but it's also dealing with quite a difficult topic in one part. So there's sort of two storylines going here. We're following this woman who is early 30s, I think. She lives in London. Her father is suffering with dementia, I think, and there's sort of a lot of discussion about that in the book, and like how are they going to deal with that? What care do they need to make sure he has? So that's one part of the book. And then the other part is that she has decided she wants to date again after the breakup of a long-term relationship and sort of a period of being single. And she meets this guy on like a dating app. They become like super close to one another for about 3 months, and then he ghosts her. And so you're sort of following the story of her being ghosted and like how she deals with that, and just like about what it's like to like date and try and find someone when you're in your 30s, especially if you're trying to find them like via dating apps. And then also this story about how her and her mum are coping with her dad's illness. And I just didn't like the protagonist. I think you're supposed to like her. I thought she was very mean, very judgmental about everybody. I also think, like, I'm not saying her mum wasn't slightly annoying, but she's very rude to her mum, very controlling. And I was hoping we'd sort of come full circle at the end with that, and she'd realise that she has these character traits that are just quite controlling, bossy and judgmental, especially towards her mum. And you get a tiny bit of acknowledgement, but nowhere near enough for me. And yeah, also the end was weird. I don't want to spoil anything. I know a lot of people had a big issue with the ending. I was like, what the fuck? Where did that come from? Odd. So I wouldn't read another book by this author. Didn't like the protagonist. Thought again there was quite a lot of privilege there, and for something that was supposed to be like an easy read, it ended up annoying me quite a bit. Then I read a physical book, and that is Without Warning and Only Sometimes, Scenes from an Unpredictable Childhood by Kit de Waal. I've had a really mixed reaction to Kit de Waal because I loved My Name is Leon. I then read The Trick to Time and Supporting Cast and thought they were just sort of mediocre. And this was somewhere in between those two. I was really enjoying this, and then I found the last chunk just not as strong as the rest. So Kit de Waal grew up in the 70s in Birmingham to a white Irish mother who became a Jehovah's Witness and got all of her children to become Jehovah's Witnesses, and a black father. I think he's from St. Kitts, although I'm not going to be able to remember off the top of my head. And she had quite an odd upbringing in that her father worked, but he sent all of his money back to the Caribbean to try and buy a house there. And so their mother worked like a ridiculous amount of jobs to try and care for the family. And there was never really enough food on the table. They lived quite a sort of impoverished life. But there's also loads of sort of nostalgia. I thought that them being raised as Jehovah's Witnesses would be sort of a bigger part of the story, but it felt like, at least the way she presented it, it never becomes too big a part of their life because their father refuses to participate. And so there isn't that sort of ultimate control over the household that there would otherwise be from that religion. I enjoyed this. I think she has a really warm voice, really great at writing childhood stories, family dramas, like I said, sort of reeks of nostalgia. The way she talks about like a chippy dinner and stuff like that, I really liked. And yeah, so I was really enjoying it. But in the final section, she is like 18, 19, and she's sort of left home. And I think she goes that far into her adult years because she wants to get you to the point where she loves books, because really as a child she doesn't. But actually those years are really depressing. So it felt like a really sad note to end the book on, but also just quite jarring. You know, you went through this childhood that, yes, was difficult, but also, you know, children can cope quite well with difficulties, depending on how severe they are, of course, but sort of children can make their own fun and all that sort of stuff. So it never felt too dire. And then you get to this section where she's sort of 18, 19 and you're like, fucking hell, like that's pretty dark. And then there's just this little wrap up about her finding books, and isn't that lovely? So yeah, I would almost rather it ended before that, even though you then wouldn't have got to the point where she loved books. So I enjoyed it, but I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I would. Then my biggest success of the month was Mystic and Rider by Sharon Shin. This is the first book in the 12 Houses series. These came out in the early 2000s, and I think I've realised that my niche in fantasy is 90s and early 2000s. I really like sort of the type of fantasy that was coming out around then, and so I'm definitely going to try and read lots more fantasy books from that time period, especially written by women. So I had listened to Summers at Castle Auburn by this author, which was YA fantasy standalone. This is an adult fantasy book, and it's the first book in a 5-book series. And in a lot of regards, it's quite straightforward, which is a big part of what I enjoy. This is like super cozy. If somebody said to me, can you give me a cozy fantasy recommendation, this would be my number one pick. I found it really comforting, really familiar, and I just really liked all the characters. The premise of this is that you are in this realm called Gullingaria, and you are following a group of 5 people who have been sent on a quest by the king to find out why there seems to be some sort of political unrest throughout the kingdom. And the political unrest seems to be linked to the fact that some humans are called mystics, and they have magical abilities, varying magical abilities. They can all do different things. Some of them can transform to animals, some of them can control fire, some of them can read minds, all different things. And lots of people don't like mystics and sort of want them to be persecuted, and the king doesn't agree. He supports mystics. So there is a feeling that some of the political unrest could be to do with that. And the lead of this 5-person band, as depicted on the cover, is Seneth, and she is an incredibly powerful mystic who controls fire in like various amazing ways. And yeah, so you're sort of following this group of people who sort of become like found family. This is mainly set around the campfire as they camp for the night, or in various inns. There's lots of like tavern scenes, which I love. And it feels sort of plotless in terms of the political unrest. Like the magic system isn't very complicated, the politics isn't very complicated. This book feels like it's much more character focused. There is a romance at the heart of this book, which I thought was really well done. I really enjoyed it. But when you get to the end of the book, there does start to feel like maybe some more interesting mysteries are developing for the later books. So I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. This isn't a 5-star read for me because, you know, the fantasy world in and of itself just wasn't unique enough, or like the politics wasn't sort of developed enough for me to absolutely love it. But I had such a wonderful time reading it, and I immediately ordered the second book, which is The 13th House. Now, the way this series works is that each book is from a sort of different person in that found family's perspective. So in this book, you're following, is her name Kira? I'm pretty sure. Yeah, Kira. And Kira's actually my least favourite person in that group of found family. So I was a bit gutted that she's the next perspective. She has the ability to change her form. She can change to look like different people, but also animals, which is really cool. Also great, like, animal and nature vibes in these books. The descriptions of nature and weather and the landscape is beautiful. This book is sort of widely accepted to be the weakest book in the series because most people don't love Kira, and also there is a romance again at the heart of this one, and the romance is sort of an affair in that the man Kira is interested in is married, and she makes a lot of mistakes. I don't think you're supposed to agree with what she's doing, but it's also still pretty difficult to sort of have any hopes for her because you're just completely against it and you just think she's being a bit of an idiot. This definitely develops all the sort of political movements, so I think that's definitely become stronger in this book. But yeah, didn't love the way the romance went. And also the premise of this is that they are sort of on another quest for the king, but in this one they are with sort of high society. So they are at balls, they are staying with like lords and ladies in their castles or their manors. And so I much prefer sort of like tavern scenes and campfire scenes to, you know, big dining halls and ball scenes. That's just a personal preference. This is probably always going to be my least favourite of the 5. But yeah, I gave this like 2 stars. I think it had a lot of issues, but I'm still very excited to carry on because, like I said, most people say this is the weakest and then the others are all as good as the first. So we're on to the last 2 books, and this is another memoir I listened to on audio, and I also had sort of mixed feelings about this one, but I think this is more like a me thing, and I think a lot of other people will really enjoy this book. So I'll explain why I didn't, and then you can maybe think, well, actually, that would work for me, hopefully. And that is Easy Beauty by Chloe Cooper-Jones, again, narrated by the author. So the blurb says, I am in a bar in Brooklyn listening to 2 men, my friends, discuss whether or not my life was worth living. So begins Chloe Cooper-Jones' bold account of moving through the world in a body that looks different than most. Born with a rare congenital condition called sacral agenesis, she must contend not only with her own physical pain, but the emotional discomfort of others. And then it does go on to say that this book discusses art and philosophy, but I don't know, I didn't think from the blurb that it was going to discuss art and philosophy as much as it does. If you ask me, what are 2 themes in books that are going to put you off, I would literally say art and philosophy. And that is like what Chloe Cooper-Jones' field of study is on. I think she's on her 2nd PhD, and she's a philosophy major, and she is very interested in what we mean by beauty, especially as it pertains to art. I'm really not into philosophical discussions, and maybe that sounds a bit like I'm encompassing too large a topic. But when someone just starts to talk about old dead philosophers that are usually white men, and then sort of relates that to some modern day thought process about like the reason for living or the reason for art, I just think there's so many other things in this world we need to figure out and we need to worry about, that why would I want to dwell on this? Like it just feels a bit like existential. I'm just going to think about these things because I can. I don't care. I also am really not a fan of, like, for example, if I were to go to loads of these wonderful cities with really famous museums that I'm sure lots of you have been to and loved, unless they were contemporary art, I would not be going in because I have pretty much zero interest in all these old sort of statues and sort of famous paintings and stuff. I don't care. So I don't really like, most of the art I like is contemporary art, right? So a lot of the book focuses on that. There is also a large focus in the book on her father, and her father is a dick. When she was being raised, her dad would sort of flit off. He had loads of affairs, and then he basically got to the point where he was like, I'm out, and he just sort of opted out of helping to raise his own child with her mother. Her mother is amazing, and she does spend time in the book talking about her mother, but she spends much more time talking about her father and talking about how like him she is and how neither of them can ever be content and they always want more, and in wanting more, they sometimes sort of pull away from their loved ones, like their children and their partners. And I understand that the reason she kept talking about him was because she was fearful that she was like him. But I also just found that it was sort of like hero worshipping somebody who I really didn't think should be hero worshipped. So I guess I don't think Chloe Cooper-Jones is at the point yet where she never really says, like, he massively let me down and, like, bit of a dick and I don't know why I'm wasting my time with him. Like, she's not there yet. She may never be there. And so, yeah, there was elements of this I really enjoyed. I think her voice in and of itself is interesting. She has lots of interesting things to say. But when she spent the majority of that talking about art, philosophy or her dad, I was, like, not loving it. I also found that at points, like, for example, there's a whole chapter about the fact that she ended up being sent to some tennis tournament, can't remember which one, because she's a journalist and she was going to write about it. And she was like, I literally don't know how to write about tennis, but I've got this gig. And then she just sort of does this whole chapter about tennis and, you know, what she thinks of certain players and stuff. And it just sometimes felt like maybe, why is it in here? Like, it feels really like a separate essay. It doesn't really link back to the collection. I wasn't really sure in the point of it. So yeah, I didn't love this, but I think if you were into discussions about art and philosophy, you would adore this. So yeah, there's that. And then lastly, this one has hit the nail in the coffin for me with Maggie O'Farrell. I have The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox. I have now read nearly all of her books. I have read After You'd Gone, My Lover's Lover, The Distance Between Us, The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox, Instructions for a Heatwave, Hamnet, and I Am. So I've got 2 of her older books and her newest book still to read. And basically I read her first book and I read Hamnet and I really enjoyed both of them. So I carried on, and since then all of her books have been like 2 stars for me, sometimes nearer to 3, but like not great. And I thought this would be my favourite because I loved the premise. I love novels that are set across 2 time periods, you know, like a contemporary time period, looking back on the past with these people being linked. And this is we're following a young woman in sort of contemporary time. She gets a phone call saying, we have your aunt, Esme Lennox. We run a sort of psychiatric ward and she's been here for over 60 years and we're shutting down. We have no funding and she is safe to come out in society, so can you come collect her? She's like, what the fuck? Didn't even know I had an aunt. Like, or great aunt. I thought my nan was an only child. And you then get 3 perspectives. You get the perspective of, I think her name is Iris. Yeah, Iris, who's having to go collect her aunt. You get the perspective of Esme Lennox from the moment when she was 16 back in the 1930s and she got institutionalised. You find out why. And you also get the perspective of Iris's grandmother, who is Esme's sister, and she now has dementia. And so her sections are like her thoughts and they jump around all over the place and you sort of get hints as to why she's hidden the fact that she has this sister all these years and why her sister's been institutionalised all these years. There are a couple of reveals that I think you can pretty much guess from the start, maybe even from just hearing the blurb. So I didn't think they were that exciting. I think this is a really important topic to talk about, how easily institutionalised women were in this time period and sort of, predating the 1930s, and how just abhorrent that is, and how also somebody who goes into one of these institutions completely sane isn't completely sane when they've been kept there for a significant portion of time, not only due to the nature of their environment, but because of the amount of drugs they're on and the various treatments they're put through. I think it's a massively important topic. I don't think it was dealt with poorly here. I just don't think it was dealt with that well either. I really didn't like Iris. I've realised that Maggie O'Farrell, other than Hamnet, tends to write women who are a bit aloof and sort of cold, quite unlikable, tend to be dating married men and just not really caring that they're, having an affair. And you're supposed to root for that. Like in this, she wants to have a relationship with her stepbrother, but they were raised together since the age of 8 or something, so a bit weird. And you're supposed to want them to work out. Very odd. And he's a dick, she's not great. So yeah, I don't really like the way she writes her female leads. I also don't like the way she writes the sort of male romantic interest, and I just didn't think any of the rest of the novel was very well dealt with. So this was like a 2-star read for me, and I won't be picking up any more Maggie O'Farrell. I've just accepted that she had a couple of books I really enjoyed, and that's that. She doesn't work for me, and I'm just fed up with reading the same woman but in a different story, because why would I want to do that? So there you go. Those are all the books I read in the month of October. Like I said, a very mixed bag. Pretty much feel that other than Mystic and Rider, which I really enjoyed, it was just completely mediocre or lower than mediocre. And it's not like I don't DNF really easily. Like I said, I DNF'd about 10 books in October. But I think because a lot of these were audio, they were easy enough to get through. And I think that's part of the reason I carried on. Loads of these, if I'd been reading physically, I would have DNF'd. And I also think that October was just a month where I wasn't massively into reading, so I was fine just like reading something or listening to something that was easy enough to finish. And so it didn't really matter as much that I wasn't loving it, if that makes sense. But I'm really into reading again now, and I'm hoping to have a much more successful November reading month. So, fingers crossed. Let me know if you've read any of these books. I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on them, seeing as I didn't enjoy most of them, or, you know, like I said, just thought they were like a mixed bag. And I'd also like to know, like, what you do when you've had a rubbish reading month. Do you tend to just take a break from reading to try and reset? Or do you reach for a book that you're certain is going to be 5 stars? Or do you do what I've done, which is reread some favourites? I've just reread a book because I just wanted to read something that was actually good and that I knew for sure was going to be good. So yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.